We need to talk about Galadriel, not the ethereal queen of the golden wood who gives solemn gifts and cryptic advice, not the luminous figure cloaked in starlight, serene and untouchable. We know that version of her. We've seen it, we've read it, we've admired it. But there's another story hiding just beneath the surface, a story that begins not with a gift, but with a question, a deeply uncomfortable question that changes everything we think we know about the wisest and fairest of all the elves remaining in Middle-earth. She held Nenya, the Ring of Adamant, one of the 3 elven rings forged in secret, untouched by Sauron's malice. Through it, her power was to preserve, to protect, to ward off the decay of time. And more than that, it gave her sight, a keen and terrible perception. Tolkien tells us she could perceive the mind of Sauron, that they were locked in a silent, telepathic struggle across the long years. She knew he was out there. She felt his will. She saw his shadow lengthening. So here's the thing nobody talks about. Why did she wait so long? Why did the Lady of Lorien, a founder of the White Council, possessed of a power that could hold back the sea of time itself, allow the enemy to gather strength for centuries in Dol Guldur, a fortress practically on her doorstep? We are told it was Saruman who stayed the council's hand, who counselled patience and deceitfully claimed the One Ring was lost forever. But are we really to believe that Galadriel, who never trusted Saruman, who wanted Gandalf to lead the council from the very beginning, was so easily swayed? That she, with her unique insight into the enemy's mind, simply deferred to a voice she knew to be compromised? What we're about to uncover is not a story of simple wisdom or cautious strategy. It's a story about the terrible weight of foresight, the paralyzing burden of power, and a choice made in the shadows that is far harder to forgive than the simple narratives would have us believe. What if the light of Lothlorien wasn't just a beacon against the darkness, but also a beautiful, gilded cage? And what if its guardian, in her desperate attempt to keep the last lamp of the High Elves from flickering out, was willing to let the rest of the world grow very, very dark indeed? The official history of the Third Age paints a clear, if somewhat frustrating, picture. Sauron, defeated at the end of the Second Age, is not destroyed. His spirit endures. Around the year 1050, that spirit takes shape and begins to inhabit the fortress of Dol Guldur in the south of Mirkwood. It is a shadow, a nameless fear at first, known only as the Necromancer. But the wise feel it. Gandalf is the first to suspect the truth. But it is Galadriel who is central to the organized response. She's instrumental in forming the White Council, a gathering of the most powerful beings in Middle-earth. Herself, Elrond, Círdan, Gandalf, Saruman, and other great lords of the Eldar. Their purpose is singular, to understand and counter this rising darkness. Galadriel's credentials for this role are unimpeachable. She is the last of the great Noldor in Middle-earth who saw the light of the Two Trees in Valinor. She has lived for thousands of years, witnessed the rise and fall of empires, and personally stood against the original Dark Lord Morgoth. Her power, amplified by Nenya, is immense. Her wisdom, born of ages of sorrow and vigilance, is said to be second only to Melian, the Maya, the Queen of Doriath from the First Age. And crucially, she distrusts Saruman from the outset. She senses the pride and the nascent corruption in him. She champions Gandalf to lead the council, a move Saruman, as head of the Order of Istari, resents and overrules, so the pieces are all there. A known threat, a powerful council, a wise and perceptive leader who correctly identifies the traitor in their midst. And yet, for nearly 2,000 years, nothing of substance is done. The necromancer's power grows, the forest of Mirkwood sickens, orcs multiply, and the world becomes a more dangerous place. The timeline is damning. The White Council first meets in 2463. Gandalf argues for an immediate, preemptive strike on Dol Guldur. Saruman, however, argues against it. He begins his long study of the rings of power and assures the Council that the One Ring has been washed out to sea, lost forever. His counsel is to watch and wait, and for almost 400 years they do. It is not until 2850 that Gandalf secretly enters Dol Guldur, confirms that the necromancer is indeed Sauron, and finds Thrain, Thorin Oakenshield's father, who gives him the map and key to Erebor. Armed with this definitive proof, Gandalf returns to the Council and again demands an attack. Again, Saruman overrules him. And again, the Council acquiesces. It takes another 91 years before the final assault on Dol Guldur is launched, the one we see dramatized in the Hobbit films. The accepted reason for this catastrophic delay is Saruman's treachery. He was secretly searching for the ring himself near the Gladden Fields and didn't want the Council interfering. He manipulated them. He deceived them. This is the story we are given. And it places Galadriel in the role of a frustrated but ultimately passive victim of this deception. A wise queen who was sadly outmaneuvered. But this explanation is too simple. It's too clean. It absolves the most powerful elf in Middle-earth of any true agency, portraying her as a figurehead rather than the formidable political and mystical force she truly was. It asks us to believe that her immense power of perception, her direct line of sight into the enemy's very mind, was somehow clouded by the political maneuvering of a wizard she already knew to be corrupt. It just doesn't add up. The key to unlocking this mystery, the piece that reframes the entire picture, isn't found in the minutes of the White Council meetings. It's found in the very nature of the ring she wore on her finger. To understand Galadriel's choices, we have to understand Nenya. The 3 rings of the elves were fundamentally different from the 7 of the dwarves and the 9 of men. They were not made to dominate or to conquer. They were not weapons of war. Their power was far more subtle and, in its own way, far more profound. Narya, the ring of fire worn by Gandalf, had the power to inspire hope and kindle courage in others. Vilya, the ring of air worn by Elrond, was the mightiest of the 3, possessing powers of healing and protection. But Nenya, the ring of water, the ring of adamant, had a singular, desperate purpose: preservation. Its function was to hold back the ravages of time, to prevent decay, to keep things as they were. Lothlorien, the Golden Wood, was not merely a beautiful forest. It was an artifact of this power. It was a land held outside of time, where the memory of the elder days was kept alive, untarnished by the slow grief and fading that afflicted the rest of the world. For Galadriel, who had seen the light of Valinor before the sun and moon were even made, this was everything. She had watched the world she loved crumble over millennia. She had seen great cities fall, heroes die, and the magic of her people diminish, generation by generation. Lothlorien was her final, defiant stand against that entropy. It was her attempt to build a small, perfect piece of Valinor in the heart of a dying Middle-earth. And Nenya was the tool that made it possible. But here lies the terrible, double-edged nature of such a power. Preservation, by its very definition, is a defensive act. It is about holding a line, not advancing one. It is about protecting what is, not forging what could be. The core of Nenya's magic is a form of stasis, a beautiful, shimmering, golden stasis, but stasis nonetheless. And this, I believe, became the core of Galadriel's own philosophy. Her primary objective, for centuries, was not the final defeat of Sauron. It was the survival of Lothlorien. Think about what that means. Every decision, every calculation would be run through that filter. An open war with Sauron, Even a preemptive strike on Dol Guldur would have been an immense risk, not just to the armies of the elves, but to the very secrecy of her power. If she were to openly move against Sauron, she would have to reveal the strength of Lorien, and in doing so, reveal the presence of one of the three rings. She would paint a giant target on the one place in Middle-earth she was sworn to protect. Sauron craved the three. He knew they were out there, and he believed they were the key to dominating the remaining elves. For Galadriel, entering an open conflict was like a king moving his queen out from behind her pawns in the opening moves of a chess game. It was a declaration of intent that could invite a devastating counterattack. So she chose a different strategy, a strategy of containment, a strategy of silence. She would use Nenya's power not to project force outward, but to turn it inward, strengthening the borders of her own realm, making the Golden Wood a fortress of light that the shadow could not penetrate. Her silence wasn't born of ignorance. It was a calculated policy of non-intervention, rooted in the desperate, tragic desire to save the last beautiful thing in a world falling to ruin. She was not a general fighting a war. She was a curator guarding a museum, and she was willing to let the city burn around it as long as the flames didn't touch the walls. This brings us to the silent war, the one fought not on battlefields with swords and banners, but in the unseen realms of the mind. Tolkien is explicit about this. Galadriel and Sauron were aware of each other. She, through Nenya, could perceive his growing malice and his designs. He, with the full force of his own Maya spirit, could feel her presence, a light in the world that resisted him, and he desperately sought to find her, to dominate her mind, and to locate the ring she protected. This was not a passive state of affairs. It was an active, ongoing, centuries-long duel. Imagine it. Two immense consciousnesses, probing, shielding, feinting. Sauron projects his will, a wave of despair, fear and command, seeking to find a crack in the defenses of the wise. Galadriel, from her fastness in Lorien, stands as a silent wall of light, deflecting his thought, hiding her own mind and the location of Nenya behind a veil of secrecy. She would have seen visions, glimpses into his mind. Not his detailed plans. Sauron was far too cunning for that. But the character of his thought, the depth of his hatred, the scale of his ambition, the patient, methodical evil of his strategy. She would have felt the gathering of the orcs, the corruption of the beasts, the slow poisoning of the very earth. She would have known, with a certainty no one else could possess, that the necromancer was not some minor sorcerer, but the ancient enemy returned in full. And Sauron, in turn, would have felt her. He wouldn't have been able to pinpoint Lorien, not at first, because the power of Nenya was also one of concealment. But he would have known one of the three was being used against him. He would have felt a will that denied him entry, a power that held a domain inviolate. The entire land of Lorien was, to his mind, a blank spot on the map, an infuriating void where his sight could not penetrate. This creates a terrifying stalemate. For Galadriel to act openly, to provide the White Council with the full, unvarnished truth of what she saw in Sauron's mind, would be to give him the very thing he was looking for, a clear signal of her location and the nature of her power. It would be like a hidden sniper taking a shot and revealing their position to the entire enemy army. Her greatest weapon, her perception, was also her greatest vulnerability. The very act of using her knowledge would neutralize its advantage. So she chose to withhold. She would have shared fragments, warnings, feelings of dread. But the full picture, the terrifying certainty she must have possessed, she kept that to herself. She played the long game, believing that as long as Sauron did not know where she was, as long as Lorien remained a hidden sanctuary, she could outlast him. She would hold her piece of paradise intact, a seed of the elder days that could hopefully blossom again after the storm had passed. Her silence, therefore, was not passive. It was an active strategy of concealment. It was a shield, but every shield casts a shadow. And the shadow cast by Galadriel's silence was long, and it fell upon many innocent people who did not have a magic ring and a timeless forest to protect them. Here we arrive at the most uncomfortable part of this story, the part that shifts Galadriel from a wise, cautious Queas into something far more tragic and, frankly, more culpable. What was the price of Lothlorien's preservation? What was the cost of her centuries-long silence? While she maintained her perfect, timeless realm, the rest of the world suffered the direct consequences of her inaction. The shadow that fell on Mirkwood didn't just stay there. It grew. It spread. The high pass in the Misty Mountains, once a relatively safe route, became infested with goblins. The kingdom of Angmar, led by the Witch King, rose in the north and destroyed the Dúnedain kingdoms of Arnor. The Rangers of the North became a scattered, hunted people, fighting a lonely, desperate war to keep evil at bay from the borders of places like the Shire. And all the while, the fortress of Dol Guldur, the very heart of this spreading poison, was allowed to fester, less than 100 miles from the borders of the Golden Wood. Galadriel, with her profound sight, would have been aware of all of this. She would have felt the suffering of the sylvan elves of Mirkwood under Thranduil, her own kin. She would have sensed the growing despair of the men of the Vales of Anduin. She would have known the true nature of the evil that the Rangers fought in the Lonely Lands. She was not ignorant of these events. She simply prioritized. The safety of Lorien came first. The survival of her people, the preservation of that last fragment of Valinorian light, was the one non-negotiable term in her silent war against the dark. Everything else was a secondary concern. Let's try to imagine this, not as a point on a timeline, but as a lived reality. Imagine being Galadriel, standing on the flets of Caerra's Galadon. You look eastward, and with the power of your mind and your ring, you can feel the sickness in the forest. You can sense the fear of the woodman, the despair of the elves hiding in Thranduil's halls. You know the source. You know its name is Sauron. You know that a decisive blow could, perhaps, end it. But you also know that to strike that blow is to risk everything you have built. It is to invite the great eye to turn its full gaze upon you. And so you make a choice. You don't strike out. Instead, you turn your power inward. You strengthen the girdle of Melian that protects your borders. You pour more of your will into Nenya, making the light of your kingdom brighter, its defenses stronger, its reality more separate from the darkening world outside. You save your own. This is not the act of a monster. It is a deeply, tragically understandable choice. It is the choice of a refugee who has lost everything, time and time again, and is now clinging to the last remnant of her home with every fibre of her being. But it is a selfish choice. It is a form of magical isolationism. And it meant that for centuries, while the people of Lorien lived in timeless peace, the people of the rest of Rhovanion paid the price in blood and fear. Galadriel did not create the shadow, but by refusing to move against it for so long, she allowed it to lengthen and consume others. This reframes the entire dynamic of the White Council. It was never just about Saruman's deception. It was about a clash of competing agendas, hidden beneath a veneer of unified purpose. Saruman wanted to find the ring for himself. Gandalf wanted to confront the evil directly and protect the common folk of Middle-earth. And Galadriel wanted to maintain the status quo for as long as possible. She was playing for a stalemate, not a victory. From this perspective, Saruman's arguments for delay were not just a deception she fell for, they were a convenient excuse. She knew he was not to be trusted, but his counsel aligned perfectly with her own secret policy of containment. He provided the political cover she needed to justify her own inaction to the rest of the council. She could appear to be the wise, cautious voice, reluctantly agreeing with Saruman's superior authority, all the while knowing that his delays were serving her primary goal, keeping the war away from Lorien's borders. This makes her a far more complex and politically astute figure. She wasn't a passive victim. She was an active participant in the delay, albeit for different reasons than Saruman. She was using his greed and ambition as a shield for her own fear and her own desperate preservationism. Think of the power dynamics. She is the most ancient and revered member. Elrond is her son-in-law. Gandalf is her ally and friend. Her voice carries immense weight. If she had thrown her full support behind Gandalf's call for an attack in 2851, it is almost certain the council would have acted. Saruman would have been isolated, but she didn't. She allowed herself to be overruled. Why? Because a full-scale assault was a risk she was not yet willing to take. The necromancer was contained. His influence was spreading, yes, but it had not yet touched the borders of her own realm. The delicate balance, the terrible stalemate, was holding. Why be the one to upset it? The questions begin to accelerate, to pile one on top of the other, each one more damning than the last. Did she see Saruman beginning to create his own ring of power? Did she feel his mind falling under the sway of Sauron? Her perception was keen enough to pierce the veil of Sauron himself. Could she truly have been blind to the corruption of the wizard standing next to her? Or did she see it and tolerate it because his presence was a useful buffer, a complication that kept all eyes focused on him and not on her? Was her long game so long that she was willing to sacrifice pawns and even a fellow bishop like Saruman to protect her queen? This is no longer a story about good versus evil. It's a story about competing self-interests, about the cold calculus of power. Galadriel was not evil. She was, in the final analysis, on the side of the free peoples. But her timeline was not their timeline. Her priorities were not their priorities. She was operating on a scale of millennia, and she was willing to accept centuries of suffering in the wider world if it meant buying a few more precious years of peace for the one place that mattered to her most. The climax of this long, silent strategy comes with the attack on Dol Guldur. In the year 2941, the same year as the events of The Hobbit, the White Council finally acts. They put forth their strength and drive Sauron from his fortress. On the surface, it is a great victory. The necromancer is expelled, and Mirkwood can begin to heal. This is the moment the forces of good finally get their act together and land a decisive blow. But that's not what happened at all. We learn later from Gandalf himself that Sauron was not defeated. He merely retreated. In fact, the attack served his purposes perfectly. His long deception as the necromancer had run its course. He had used the time to weaken his enemies, to let the kingdoms of men and dwarves fall into ruin and mistrust, and to secretly search for the ring. By 2941, he was ready to declare himself openly and return to Mordor to rebuild Barad-dûr. The White Council's attack wasn't a preemptive strike. It was a belated eviction notice served to a tenant who was already packing his bags. Sauron feigned defeat. He abandoned Dol Guldur willingly because it was time for the next phase of his plan. The entire victory was, in fact, Sauron's gambit. He drew his enemies' attention to a secondary fortress, made them expend energy to take it, and then slipped away to his true seat of power, leaving them celebrating a hollow success. Now place Galadriel at the center of this, she who can perceive his mind, she who has been in a silent duel with him for 1,000 years. Are we to believe she did not sense the feint, that she couldn't feel the difference between a spirit being truly vanquished and one making a strategic withdrawal? It seems impossible. A being of her power and perception would have felt the truth of the situation. She would have sensed the lack of true fear in Sauron's mind, the undercurrent of triumphant strategy beneath the performance of retreat. She must have known they were being played, and if she knew, then the attack on Dol Guldur becomes something else entirely. It was a piece of necessary theatre. By this point, Gandalf's discovery of the ring's reappearance was imminent. The threat was becoming too great to ignore. The balance of power was shifting. Galadriel's policy of containment was no longer viable. She had to act. But the attack was not about defeating Sauron. It was about forcing his hand, yes, but on their terms. And more importantly, it was about pushing him east, away from Lorien. The assault on Dol Guldur was a strategic maneuver to herd the threat away from her own borders. It was a success, not because it harmed Sauron, but because it moved the future battlefields away from the Vales of Anduin and towards Gondor and Rohan. It was the final, terrible act of her long preservationist policy. She helped push the coming storm onto someone else's house. This, then, is the core insight, the devastating truth at the heart of Galadriel's character. For most of the Third Age, her primary motivation was not the salvation of Middle-earth. It was the preservation of Lothlorien. Her goal was not to win the war, but for her people to survive it. This reframes every action, every word, every silence. The long delays in the White Council, the tolerance of Saruman's manipulations, the final, seemingly triumphant assault on Dol Guldur, all of it was filtered through a single, desperate question. What is best for Lorien? This isn't a condemnation, not entirely. It's a tragedy. It's the story of a leader burdened with an impossible choice. On one hand, the fate of the world. On the other, the last living memory of a world that had already been lost. She chose to protect the memory. She chose the past over the future. And in so doing, she becomes a profoundly human figure, stripped of her ethereal perfection. Her story is no longer about unwavering wisdom, but about the corrupting influence of a love that becomes too possessive, a grief that becomes too paralyzing. She loved the light of the elder days so much that she was willing to let the lights of the present world go out, one by one, as long as her own lamp kept burning. And this is where her story pivots from the specifics of a fantasy epic to a universal human truth. Her dilemma is the dilemma of any person, any community, any nation that has something beautiful to protect in a dangerous world. It is the temptation of the gated community, the isolated nation, the person who turns off the news because it's too painful and focuses only on their own home and garden. When does prudence become cowardice? When does self-preservation become unforgivable selfishness? Galadriel's story is a vast, mythological exploration of that very question. She built a paradise, and, for a time, she was willing to listen to the screams from beyond the wall and tell herself it was the necessary price of keeping paradise alive. Her perfection is a facade. Beneath it lies a deep, ancient fear of loss, a fear so profound that it drove her to the brink of moral failure. The real-world echo of this is deafeningly loud. We see it everywhere. We see it in leaders who prioritize the economic health of their own nation at the cost of global climate stability. We see it in communities that fight to keep out shelters or low-income housing to preserve their property values. We see it in ourselves when we feel the pull of apathy, the desire to retreat from the world's overwhelming problems and focus only on the small circle of things we can control: our family, our home, our own peace of mind. Galadriel's Lorien is the ultimate symbol of this retreat. It is a perfect, self-contained world, a sanctuary from the sorrows of the present, but its perfection is maintained by a willful ignorance of the suffering just beyond its borders. And this reveals who the overlooked heroes of the Third Age truly were. They were not the powerful elven lords in their hidden realms. The heroes were the nameless rangers of the north, freezing in the wilderness to guard the Shire. They were the men of Gondor, standing watch on the walls of Osgiliath for centuries, bleeding and dying to hold back the shadow from the east. They were the Rohirrim, the people of Dale, the dwarves of the Iron Hills. They were the ones who had no magic ring, no secret valley, no power to turn back time. All they had was the courage to stand on the front lines, to face the darkness that the powerful had allowed to grow. Their struggle, their sacrifice, was the direct, tangible cost of the long, silent game of chess being played by the likes of Galadriel and Saruman. While Galadriel watched and waited from her timeless sanctuary, they were the ones paying the price in blood, generation after generation. They lived in the decaying world that her power was meant to hold at bay, and she chose to hold it at bay only for herself and for her own. Her final redemption only comes when she is confronted with the ultimate tool of power, the One Ring, and finds the strength to refuse it. That is the moment her perspective finally shifts. In the end, it all comes down to that one moment by the mirror. Frodo, a simple hobbit who has seen the true cost of this war, offers her the One Ring. He offers her the power to make her deepest desire a reality. To preserve Lorien not just for an age, but forever. To become a queen, strong and terrible, and to command the world to her will. And for a moment, she is tempted. She shows him what she would become. In place of the Dark Lord, you would have a queen. Not dark, but beautiful and terrible as the morning and the night, fair as the sea and the sun and the snow upon the mountain, dreadful as the storm and the lightning, stronger than the foundations of the earth. All shall love me and despair. This is not just a temptation. It is a confession. It is the secret ambition she has harbored for millennia, the desire to use power to stop change, to stop loss, laid bare. This is the ultimate expression of her preservationist instinct, magnified to a terrifying, world-altering scale. But then she lets it go. She laughs, and the vision fades. "I pass the test," she says. "I will diminish, and go into the west, and remain Galadriel." In that moment, she finally accepts the one thing she has fought against for an entire age, the inevitability of fading. She chooses to let Lorien diminish. She chooses to accept the long defeat. She chooses to give up her power and her kingdom for the sake of the world. It is her greatest moment, because it is the moment she finally repudiates the very philosophy that has guided her for 3,000 years. She chooses the world over her garden, and so we return to the mirror of Galadriel. The mirror that shows things that were, things that are, and some things that have not yet come to pass. Perhaps her tragedy was not a lack of knowledge, but an excess of it. She spent so long gazing at all the possible futures, all the potential threats, that she became paralyzed by the fear of making the wrong move. She saw the storm coming, and her first instinct was to bar the doors of her own house. It took the courage of a hobbit, someone with no grand strategy or ancient power, to show her that the only way to survive the storm is to face it together, even if it means your own house might be swept away. Her light was real, her wisdom was profound, but the shadow it cast was just as real and just as long. And it serves as a quiet, timeless warning that the deepest desire to protect what we love can sometimes be the very thing that leads us to betray it. What does that mean for us? It means we have to keep asking the hard questions, even of our most revered heroes. and it means we have to be brave enough to step outside our own golden woods before the darkness grows too deep to fight.